2 weeks ago, President-elect Donald Trump refused to rule out using military or economic force to acquire Greenland from Denmark. That same week, Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong completed her 4th diplomatic tour of Pacific Island nations in 18 months, quietly signing infrastructure agreements across Fiji, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands. These two events are not unrelated. Why should you care about ice sheets and coral atolls? Because the methods being used to secure them will determine whether Australia maintains strategic autonomy or becomes a junior partner trapped between two empires. Your superannuation holds billions in regional infrastructure bonds. Your national security depends on sea lanes that run through these island chains. And your government is currently deciding whether to follow Washington's playbook or write its own. In this video, we'll examine 3 things. First, why the United States is suddenly willing to threaten allies over territory. Second, what Australia's patient diplomacy has actually achieved in the Pacific. And finally, what these contrasting approaches reveal about power, influence, and the cost of strategic mistakes. Let's begin. To understand today's situation, we need to briefly go back to a principle most Western nations believed they had retired: territorial acquisition by force. For 70 years, the post-1945 order operated on a consensus. Borders were largely frozen. Colonial empires dissolved. Wars were fought over ideology, resources, or regime change, but rarely over moving lines on maps. That consensus is now dead. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and attempted to absorb Ukraine in 2022. China has built artificial islands in disputed waters and declared them sovereign territory. And now, the incoming American administration has openly discussed annexing Greenland, seizing the Panama Canal, and absorbing Canada. These are not idle remarks. When Donald Trump first raised the Greenland issue in 2019, it was dismissed as eccentric posturing. This time, his language is different. He stated that ownership of Greenland is an absolute necessity for American national security. He refused to rule out military action, and he suggested that economic pressure on Denmark, a NATO ally, was acceptable. This represents a doctrinal shift. The question is not whether Trump is serious. The question is why Greenland matters enough to threaten a 75-year-old alliance. I want you to look closely at what Greenland actually contains. Greenland sits astride the shortest route between North America and Europe. It hosts Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, which monitors ballistic missile launches and tracks satellites. That base is American-operated, on Danish sovereign territory, under a 1951 agreement. Strategically, the United States already has what it needs. But Greenland also contains rare earth elements. Substantial deposits of neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These are essential for electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, military guidance systems, and advanced electronics. Currently, China controls 70% of global rare earth refining capacity. If Greenland's deposits were fully exploited under American jurisdiction, that dependence could be reduced. Not eliminated, but reduced. There is also the matter of ice. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping lanes are opening. The Northern Sea route along Russia's coast is becoming navigable for longer periods each year. Greenland's position gives control over access points to these routes. What's unusual here is the speed of the shift. 5 years ago, Greenland was an environmental concern and a budget burden for Denmark. Today, it is being described in Washington as a strategic imperative worth threatening an ally over. That transformation tells you something about how seriously the United States views the coming competition for resources and routes. But here is the part most headlines miss. If the United States believes it must own Greenland to secure its interests, despite having basing rights and alliance guarantees, what does that imply about the value of treaties, partnerships, and diplomatic assurances? It implies they are now considered insufficient. Now contrast that approach with what Australia has been doing in the Pacific. Since 2019, Australia has systematically rebuilt relationships across Melanesia and Polynesia that had been neglected for 2 decades. The trigger was the Solomon Islands decision in 2022 to sign a security agreement with China, allowing Chinese naval vessels to dock in Honiara. That agreement was negotiated in secret and caught Canberra completely off guard. It was a strategic failure. But rather than respond with threats or coercion, Australia changed its approach. Foreign Minister Wong has visited the region 14 times in 2 years. Australia increased aid funding by 30%. It committed to climate adaptation financing, something Pacific leaders had been requesting for a decade. And it offered infrastructure investment without the debt traps associated with China's Belt and Road loans. This is not charity. It is strategic positioning. The Pacific Islands control exclusive economic zones that cover 20% of the Earth's ocean surface. They sit across the sea lanes that carry 60% of Australia's trade. And they vote as a bloc in international forums, including the United Nations General Assembly. If China establishes permanent military facilities across this region, Australia's northern approaches become contested space. So Australia is paying for influence the old-fashioned way, by being present, by listening, and by delivering tangible benefits without demanding compliance. I want you to look closely at the results. In 2024, Vanuatu signed a policing agreement with Australia after years of resistance. Fiji expanded defense cooperation beyond symbolic joint exercises. And even the Solomon Islands, despite its Chinese security pact, agreed to Australian funding for port upgrades and telecommunications infrastructure. These are incremental gains. Not dramatic. Not headline-worthy. But they represent a strategy based on patience and consistency, rather than ultimatums and ownership claims. Now let's think through what happens next under both approaches. If the United States pursues territorial acquisition in Greenland, even successfully, what are the second-order effects? Denmark is a small nation, but it is embedded in the European Union and NATO. If Washington pressures Copenhagen into ceding territory, every alliance partner will recalibrate their assumptions about American reliability. Germany, France, and Poland will ask, if Denmark can be coerced, can we? That loss of trust is a strategic cost. It may not appear on a balance sheet, but it erodes the foundation of collective security. Third-order consequence. If America normalizes territorial demands against allies, China will cite that precedent when asserting claims in the South China Sea. Russia will reference it in Eastern Europe. The entire framework of international law, already weakened, collapses further. Now consider Australia's approach. If Pacific Island nations accept Australian investment and cooperation, what do they gain? Infrastructure, climate resilience, economic development, and maintained sovereignty. What does Australia gain? Strategic depth, trade route security, diplomatic alignment, and a counterweight to Chinese influence without provoking direct confrontation. Second-order effect. If this model succeeds, it demonstrates that influence can be built without coercion. That becomes an alternative model for middle powers globally. Third-order consequence. If Australia is seen as a reliable partner that respects sovereignty, it enhances its reputation in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, where many nations face the same choice between Chinese investment and Western pressure. This is the part most analysis overlooks. Grand strategy is not just about winning individual contests. It is about establishing patterns that others will follow or reject. America's approach in Greenland establishes the pattern that power justifies ownership. Australia's approach in the Pacific establishes the pattern that partnership can achieve security without dominance. The question is which pattern proves more durable over the next decade. So when you step back, three truths emerge. First, the competition for strategic resources and territory has returned to great power politics. The post-Cold War holiday from history is over, and nations are now acting accordingly. Second, there are two models on display. One relies on coercion, ownership, and unilateral action. The other relies on partnership, investment, and patient diplomacy. Both require resources. Both require commitment. But they produce different outcomes. Third, Australia's approach in the Pacific may be less dramatic than American threats over Greenland, but it is achieving measurable results without fracturing alliances or legitimizing territorial aggression. That is not a moral judgment. It is a strategic assessment. Here is the question I'll leave you with. Does Australia's diplomatic model in the Pacific represent genuine strategic wisdom, or is it only viable because America's military guarantee allows Canberra to avoid hard choices? If this concerns you, I strongly recommend watching my analysis on the AUKUS trap. Is Australia becoming America's 51st state? That video examines whether Australia is genuinely preparing for strategic independence, or simply locking itself deeper into dependence. The link is on screen now.